I landed a job at a diner in Ohio and discovered this bizarre rule the first night I slid onto a cracked vinyl stool and Mabel Reed pushed a laminated card across the formica like she was sliding me a menu and a warning at the same time. My car had died on a two-lane stretch where the map showed more fields than towns, and the motel clerk pointed me at the neon like it was the only honest thing left in that part of the county. The sign read, "The Last Stop," in sagging red letters, and when I walked in, the bell over the door gave a hollow, paper-thin jangle that sounded exactly like it had been wound tight 100 years ago and never let go. Mabel was shorter than I expected and tougher, with hair like ash rolled into a loose bun and hands that smelled of lemon oil and tobacco. She smiled the way people smile when they know more than they admit. Behind her, the jukebox had decided to play a song 2 keys lower than it should. The notes slid out in a lazy, syrupy twang. Eddie, the cook, stood with his back to the stove like he belonged to it. Broad shoulders, a face that had learned how to keep secrets in its creases. Nobody asked me for references. They asked if I could pull the night shift and keep my mouth shut about the weird stuff. The laminated card had been the weird stuff. It wasn't a flyer or a list of kitchen duties. It was printed on plain stock and sealed in plastic like a little talisman. Someone had typed it, but the words felt like directions written after a hard winter. No room for argument. Mabel tapped it with a knuckle as if it were fragile. "Read it," she said. She had that way of making me feel there was no choice. The rain had started up against the diner's windows in a steady, metallic hush, and the coffee on the shelf steamed in a slow silver column. The card listed rules, not policies, rules. Do not ask a customer's name. Never follow a customer to the parking lot. Count to 7 before clearing a child's cup. If the child leaves a marshmallow, leave it be. Booth 13 holds its own bargains. Do not disturb the item placed there on the 13th of any month before 3:30 a.m. The phone rings 3 times only. Pick up on the 3rd. Salt the thresholds at midnight. Iron at the 4 corners on storm nights. If you see someone dry in the rain, seat them and bring coffee. Do not pour it onto the seat. There were more, tucked in a margin in pencil, handwritten additions like afterthoughts. Freely given, no coerced debt. If you are Cassidy, speak to Iris. If a collector marks you, do not sleep entire. I read the card twice, slowly, because reading it the first time felt like stepping over a line. The second time, the words sank into the bones of the room. "You're not actually hiring night help," I said. I remember sounding incredulous. I was $40 and a busted radiator away from living in my little car. A night shift at a roadside diner sounded like salvation, even if salvation wore a name tag. But the card sat between us, paper and plastic and impossible. "We're hiring someone who can keep 2 things," Mabel said plainly, "the coffee warm and the rules unbroken." She leaned on the counter, eyes the color of old pennies, and for a moment I saw the diner whole. Its formica counters, the cracked leather of a booth, the slow drip of rain in the gutters. Like an organism with a pulse I could learn to feel if I listened hard enough. "Okay," I said, "I'll take it." If you've ever taken a job that felt like fate, tell me, what would you do when the first thing they hand you is a list that reads more like a ward than a work order? They put me on the 11 to 7, the graveyard shift where the world thins and the juke-ox plays songs for ghosts who never left. The first week was strange in soft increments. It wasn't sudden leaps into horror. It was the small, uncanny details that stacked up like coins until you realized you'd paid for something else entirely. On night 1, the rain was a steady drum. The diner smelled like coffee and wet coats. A man in a trucker's cap sat 10 feet from me, and, even through the fogged window, I could see him in a way that made my teeth feel ice cold. His boots were dry, though the rain soaked the asphalt. He ate slowly, always eating, like he was measuring the stew by the movement of his jaw. Eddie slid him hash and coffee without looking up. When the man paid, his change jittered as if it wanted to slide off the counter into nothing. Mabel handed the man a napkin with an unblinking expression and said, "Safe travels," as if that were a contract. I watched the man walk out into the rain. He left, and the headlights of his rig made halos in the downpour. From the way Eddie tapped the skillet, the trucker ought to have been a story and nothing more. That night the jukebox filled the gaps like static, and the bell over the door chimed once for no reason at all. On the third night, a family came in, 2 parents and a boy of maybe 7. They were dry, not damp in the way of someone who had stepped out of the rain underneath a porch, but dry as if the rain were a background event they had left behind. 2 of the adults talked in muted voices about a root and a funeral. The boy watched the steam from our vats like it was something alive and warm. I brewed 2 hot chocolates and, without thinking, stacked 7 marshmallows on the boy's cup. The rule was on the card: count to 7 before clearing a child's cup. I had learned that one with the clumsy ease of someone who wants to be safe. The boy hesitated before taking one of the marshmallows. He looked at me like someone searching for a name and not finding it. "Things are quieter now," he said, solemn for a kid. "They let us pass if we don't look back." Do they always talk about the root?" I asked. "They do." He smiled as if remembering a joke. Then he slid 1 marshmallow into his pocket. He left without the rest of his family. They wrapped themselves in their conversation and their dry coats and walked out into the rain. I watched the boy go, gingerly placing fingers to lips, as if checking that something remained. The plate of marshmallows sat under the counter like a small, unspent kindness. That night, Margaret Holloway, if that was what the faded name embroidered into a shawl over a chair meant, appeared for the first time. Or rather, the place around booth 5 remembered her. A napkin folded where no one had sat, a pencil line of ink where someone had once traced the hours. Eddie muttered a soft single syllable when he found the napkin and tucked it into the pocket of his apron, like one carries a relic. A dab of small things kept happening. The jukebox sometimes skipped a bar, and the tune would droop, the notes stretched as if time was tinkering with the grooves. Sometimes the bell jittered twice, and nobody came through the door. Once I saw a woman sitting in the parking lot on the curb, under no umbrella, and when I looked back with a tray, there was nothing but the sound of the rain. Eddie taught me the unwritten rules in his slow, economical way. He didn't like to explain things that couldn't be measured in spatulas. "Jukebox doesn't take requests from the dead," he'd say, and toss a slab of bacon. "Booth 13 keeps its own counsel. Keep hands away from what sits there. You wipe the counters real good, 'cause some things like clean surfaces. And don't you get cute with the phone." He said it like the phone was a sleeping animal, and he wished to keep it that way. The phone was older than any of us. It sat in a cradle beside the register, with its cord kinked like a sleeping snake. It had a ring that sounded exactly like 3 birds calling in quick succession, 3 high notes that made the skin on my forearm vibrate the same way old vinyl does when someone puts it down too hard. The rule said, the phone rings 3 times only. Pick up on the 3rd. I had no idea why. It rang the first week at 1:11 a.m. I watched it sit there and didn't move. 3 little, pure chimes. I counted in my head, and on the 3rd, like some reflex, I lifted the receiver. Silence breathed in the line. Then a single voice, so soft it might have been the sound of paper. "Do you know what keeps a door closed?" The voice sounded older than the diner. It had a paper-thin quality, as if someone had read the question aloud from a well-worn page. "Who is this?" I asked, because the rules said to keep your mouth shut, but also to answer the phone on the 3rd ring. "No name," the voice said, "just a reminder. Do not remove what booth 13 keeps."
Then the line clicked dead, as if the cord had been pinched. I told Mabel in the morning, and she smiled like someone who sees what will be and can't do much about it. They always remind us, she said, the phone likes to test the new ones. The laminated card in my pocket became a comfort and a weight.
I started carrying it like a talisman, feeling the hard plastic edge against my palm, as if the touch reassured me that at least some instructions were clear. At home, I slept badly, and sometimes in the thin hours, I would imagine the card illuminated like a map. Margaret, it turned out, left us a lot of maps. On the second week, a customer, permanent in the way of a rumor, left a pocket Bible in booth 13. An absurdly neat cursive scrawled into its margin irritated at me like an old itch. I found it because Margaret's journal fell into my lap one night when I was clearing crumbs. She had been meticulous in ways that felt like devotion. Lists, names smudged with the grease of coffee, dates, and sigils carved under the veneer of the tables. Margaret's journal was leather and had the weight of seasons in it. Her handwriting looped and hooked, and she cataloged what she called arrivals with the same patience she probably used to fold napkins. One of the entries was about a boy with marshmallows who liked to keep one in his pocket, a notation repeated with increasing fascination. Another entry cataloged the phone calls and the way the jukebox would slow down when a particular song played. In the margins, she had scratched a symbol that looked like a key with teeth that curved like a crescent moon. She called it a hagstone mark. Under booth 13, the table's underside had been gouged with initials and small crosses. Using the flashlight, the beam caught pale etchings that looked older than the diner's current life. Someone had carved a series of dots and lines around the number 13, a pattern like a clock face missing its hands. Eddie pulled down the formica with a look that made me think he'd done it before. He pointed at a small hollow that had once been sealed with wax, and with a fingernail he coaxed something out. It was a stone, a dull, pitted pebble with a hole in it, worn like a throat. It fit in the palm like a secret. "Hagstone," he said, reverence making his voice flat. "Used for seeing. Margaret kept one. Eileen had one too, before she left." That name, Eileen, did something like a bell in my chest. It was a name I recognized from somewhere I couldn't prove. It might have been the name embroidered on a handkerchief I had once seen in a box of things from my grandmother. My grandmother's name had been Eileen. I swallowed and realized I hadn't told anyone that, not the managers, nor the night cooks, nor the boy with marshmallows. The laminated card had said in small pencil at the bottom, "If you are Cassidy, speak to Iris." Cassidy. The name felt like a script waiting to be read. I ran my thumb over the hole in the stone, and a small vertigo washed through me. The edges of the counter looked like cliffs, and the room felt thinner in certain beams of light, like cloth pulled tight over a frame. Edge watched me with a look I couldn't place. Suspicion? Curiosity? Old worry. "Don't put that near your mouth," he said. "Don't hand it off without reason, and don't let it tempt you to look where you shouldn't." "Look where?" I asked. He shrugged. "Some things show you more than you ask to see." The hagstone warmed in my palm like a small animal if I held it long enough. That night, I fell asleep in the small office on a cot behind the freezer with the stone under my pillow, rationalizing that the world had given me a trinket and a job, and it wasn't my business to read too much between those lines. I had always been a person who could convince herself of things that sounded reasonable. This was one of those nights. Sleep was neither restful nor restful. I dreamed in slivers. A woman with an apron folding paper. Margaret's hands smudged with ink. A clock with a single hand stuck at 3:33. A booth with a false bottom that opened onto fields of grass and fog. I woke with the taste of coffee and a scent of rain in my mouth. On my third week, the phone did something more precise. It didn't just ring, it measured out time. The bell chimed 3 times, and between rings I could feel a kind of cool sweep, like someone opening a window in a closed room. On the 3rd ring I picked up, as if that were the only thing I had learned to do. The line was a thin thing. "This is a reminder," the voice said. The same voice, older than the booth and softer than the napkins. "Blue moon draws near. Stand where the threshold holds. Offer as it was ever offered." The words slid into the air like oil. "Offer what?" I asked, because the rules always danced around the edges of talk and never quite stepped over. "Freely given," the voice said, "not a debt. Remember that there are loopholes even in an old binding." I don't know what I expected. An explanation sounded foolish even as I wanted it. I wanted the sentence to finish in a way that cleared things, like a straight line to follow. The voice, as if hearing my impatience, left me as suddenly as it had appeared. The receiver vibrated once in my hand when a train passed in the distance, and then the line was just a chord. That night, later, near 3 in the morning, I sat alone by the counter and watched the clock creep like a mollusk. The rain had fallen away to a pale mist, and the neon bled bluish into the fog. Booth 13 was empty. I could feel something like a tension tightening across the room, like a held breath. I couldn't quite explain why my palms felt damp. The diner is small in ways that make thresholds feel meaningful. Doors are not merely timber and glass here, they are hinges in time. People slide through them, and sometimes people slip between them. Margaret's journal called the place a way station, and the word sat with me like a coat. A way station is not a place of permanent residence. It's a place where people wait or pass through. The rules were the things that kept the passing orderly. The card, "Do not ask names, do not follow, 7 marshmallows," read like a steward's checklist for souls. At 3:06 a.m. The jukebox changed its tune to something older. The notes flattened and ran backwards for a second, as if someone had lifted the needle. I felt the room inhale all at once. Outside, a shape moved toward the diner on feet barely touching the gravel. It was the sort of walk my mother used to call not terrible, the kind of step that didn't drag the past fully into the present, but let it hover. He came in wet, as if the rain had been a promise, but not a promise fulfilled. He had the sort of face that looks like a map of mispronounced towns, someone who had been everywhere and had a tired way of believing things. He took booth 13 without looking around and set an object on the table. It was small, wrapped in tan cloth, and when he folded the cloth back for a second, I thought I saw a child's shoe. I felt the card get heavier in my pocket, and, by reflex, I counted to 7, because I had been counting to 7 for a lot of things lately. The rules move like muscle memory when you are afraid. You do them because you want to make the world predictable. The man nodded at nobody and asked for black coffee and cherry pie. "Do not disturb what sits in booth 13, the card said. Do not remove items placed there before 3:33 a.m. on the 13th. It wasn't the 13th, I thought. It was another night altogether. But the man, who I would later learn was a regular named Frank, though you could not call him Frank aloud, had a look I could only describe as practiced sorrow. Mabel poured coffee and set it down like a benediction. "Pie?" she asked. He shrugged and sliced the edge. The piece he cut looked like all the other pieces of cherry pie in the world, until he lifted a forkful and looked at it like it might be a talisman. He ate with careful chewing, and his shoulders sagged like a curtain coming down on a stage. Eddie, who had been simmering the gravy with a sort of loving brutality, slipped me a glance. He didn't say anything, because Eddie thought some things weren't words. But he pointed with his chin once toward the underside of the booth, and his eyes said what he rarely said out loud, "Look." I slid beneath the laminate and felt the hollowed wood like an old secret. The booth kept more than a crust or a coin.
Tucked in the seam was a slip of paper, yellowed and folded. Margaret's hand, the same looping script, had drawn a small sigil on it and the letters Eileen in the corner. The paper shivered in my hand as if it were a living edge. I folded it carefully and put it into my pocket over the laminated card. The night seemed to bristle around me with possibilities. It was the first time my blood felt like a ledger. The card was not simply arbitrary. The rules were a net. They kept things in and kept other things out. A way station needs order. That's what keeps the passing clean. What I didn't know, what Margaret's notes hinted at with oblique sentences and careful crossings, was that the station had been maintained by bargains.
In 1953, someone had made a bargain that tied a Cassidy to a promise. The words were there in the edges of the pages, like half-heard names, but Margaret's entries stopped short of explaining the math of that bargain. "What does it cost?" I asked Eddie quietly later while I rinsed mugs. It wasn't a heroic question. It was small and stupid and necessary. I expected him to say something like a life or a soul, but Eddie was not prone to hyperbole. "Not always what you think," he said. "Sometimes it's a thing that's borrowed and tired. Sometimes it is a promise. Sometimes they wrote it in a ledger and called it payment." "Can you pay it without taking someone?" I whispered. He stilled and looked at me with an expression that let me have time to hear him. He wiped his hands on his apron and leaned in. "We don't make bargains that demand what can't be given," he said. "Not entirely. But old bargains have loopholes, and we spend our nights trying to find them. Margaret liked loopholes. She wrote in circles until they made sense." Margaret's journal had pages with words that bent like willow branches. There were entries about free will and given willingly, and the ethics of payment. There were diagrams of sigils that looked like clocks, and more than once she had written, "The hagstone focuses sight, not power, and the power must be offered, freely, not stolen." Her writing made it clear that she considered the difference between coerced sacrifice and a freely given strength as both moral and practical. The rules, in other words, were designed to steer the diner away from coercion. The nights grew stranger because the rules worked. People in transit came and left. Grief washed through like a tide and then receded. Sometimes there were things that tried the edges of the rules. Outlines of shapes on the other side of the glass. A shape that seemed to pass through the jukebox and leave it coughing up old songs. But the card seemed to hold most of it back like a dam. Then, a week later, something new happened. The card's pencil note, "If you are Cassidy, speak to Iris," made more sense when a woman came in who smelled like cedar and old perfume, who introduced herself as Iris Cassidy, and who walked through the door as if she had been expected. Iris was nothing like the polite, cautious aunt I had imagined. She was all sharp angles and eyes that measured lines in people's faces like maps. Her hair was a silver rope down her back, and she had a way of folding her hands that said she had been taught to hold a thread with one hand and cut it with the other. "Iris," I said, and the name felt like a key. "You must be Riley," she said, and when she said it, the room folded in on itself for a second, and I felt seen in a way I had not thought possible. "You took the job." I did. I showed her the card and the folded slip from booth 13. She read both slowly, and for the first time since I'd arrived, she did not smile. Her eyes grew colder in the way of someone who keeps heat for something else. "So, Margaret," she said softly, "she left you crumbs." "She left me a journal," I said. "She left a hagstone. She wrote Eileen." Eileen's name hovered over us again, as if slanting sunlight. Iris's jaw tightened like wire. "Eileen Cassidy was a woman who made bargains to keep a station open," she said. "She paid in a way that isn't the way of most deals. The bargain matters less than the contract. There are clauses we like and clauses we do not. Your bloodline carries the echo." "Echo?" I repeated. "You mean I'm bound?" Iris inhaled like she was weighing a pocket of night air. "No," she said, "but it's true that old contracts name lines. Blood is a language old paper understands." Eileen thought she could write over a clause. Sometimes you can. Sometimes a loophole is a door you can step through if you have someone to help you hold it. The words were all at once comforting and monstrous. I had wanted a job that paid the bills. Instead, I had stumbled into a ledger that had my surname in its margins. The laminated card in my pocket felt heavier than the weight of a dime. Iris sat and ordered black coffee like she had been thirsty for it for a long time. Outside, the rain had stopped and the night smelled of cut grass and ozone. "Margaret taught herself to see thin places," Iris said. "That was how she lived alongside us and not quite with us. The hagstone helps you see, but it will not save you from what you see." "Save me how?" I asked. "From the collector?" She lifted a brow at the word. "You speak the name like it is a person. It is older than people. It collects because things have a habit of falling through seams. The rules keep the seam stitched. The phone will tell you when a crossing tightens. The blue moon is one of those times when the seam thins." Her voice became smaller. "We don't like the collector. It is neither cruel nor kind. It is efficient." That night, the diner hummed with undercurrent talk and the thin echo of the jukebox. I slept badly, and when I walked the floor to wipe a table, my hand brushed something under booth 13, and I found another scrap of paper. Margaret's handwriting occupied it again. The sentence was short and fairly desperate. "Do not be tricked by the words that offer." It was a clue I couldn't parse. Margaret wrote in loops and parentheses, and she loved to leave marginalia like breadcrumbs. She wrote, "Loophole, equal value, not exact value." She drew a sigil that looked like a ring with teeth. Beneath it, a note, "Freely given, not stolen. Will convert blood to binding when combined with the hagstone and the seal under the counter." It read like instructions and a prayer, and both of them made me dizzy. I had a bag of questions, dumb and urgent and brave. How do you offer blood without someone bleeding? How does a stone convert sight into currency? What did it mean to convert blood to binding? And why did Margaret put things in the margins like she was writing to herself to keep from doing something wrong? I took the papers to Eddie, who, when I dropped them on the counter, simply stirred his gravy and kept his eyes on the steam. "You read this and you think of horror movies," he said, not unkind. But Margaret was practical. She believed in consent. She believed in the legerdemain of small kindnesses. There's a difference between giving and taking. She meant that. The hagstone refocuses. It doesn't make debts vanish. "Then what does it do?" I asked. Eddie shrugged. "Whatever the person is willing to give, it'll make useful. But it's not a machine. It will not make the world fair." Between Margaret's careful notes and Iris's bluntness, the map of my nights began to fill in. The diner was a stopping point. It was practical and ordinary and strange all at once. The rules were not eccentricities, they were wards. When a family came in and left a child's marshmallow, it was not superstition so much as a currency. The phone's third ring was a bell sounding the beginning of a transaction. Booth 13 kept its own things, and sometimes those things were pieces of people who had not finished their stories. Yet the more I learned, the more the margins darkened into the thought that called itself an obligation. Something had been promised decades ago when the diner had been smaller and the fields around it wider. A name had been written, and that name, Cassidy, sat in my lineage like a footnote that might become a sentence. I began to watch myself in the steam of coffee cups the way one watches a bruise. I had always been good at stopping myself from becoming a story I didn't like, but the diner made me a character in a ledger I hadn't opened. Night by night, as the rain moved and the jukebox bled into the hum of the refrigerators, I learned to do the small things correctly. I salted thresholds when storms threatened. I left pie slices untouched when the bell chimed thrice. I did not ask names, which turned out to be harder than it sounded, because names are the easiest way to make someone a person in the glow of a corner booth. There were rewards. People told stories that were not the serious kind. Once, a woman with a voice like river glass recounted a wedding where a man's shoes had been stolen by a restless cousin. Another night, a man in a suit, who may have been a traveling salesman or an apparition of one, left a photograph in the sugar bin, a picture of a wedding day with faces ringed in fog. Margaret's journal annotated the photo. Sometimes people misplace their days. We hold them, softly. And there were quiet comforts. Mabel made pie with an almost tender fury, pressing pastry and smearing fruit like it was a small act of defiance. Eddie laughed once, briefly, at a joke that had nothing to do with the rules, and I felt as if the diner had a heart after all. I started to like my shift. The money paid. The nights taught me rhythms I didn't know I wanted. But I could feel something gathering under the surface of the formica and the coffee steam, a pressure like the tightening of hands preparing for a handoff. Margaret's entries grew more frantic in the last pages I found. Her sigils looped into a knot. She kept the hagstone wrapped in oilcloth and wrote in a hurried hand, "If we cannot stop it, make a gift, freely, let them choose. If they will not, do not let us steal." The phone called 2 nights before the blue moon's expected rise. It rang 3 times, and when I answered, a voice I had come to know said, "It comes early this time." The line cut like a thread. I looked at the clock. The hands said 3:17. When the bell over the door rang at 3:33, it didn't sound like a bell at all. It sounded like a seam being tested. The rain had stopped entirely. Outside, the world lay bright and washed with a moon that was not yet full, but more than a sliver, thick and cold and colored almost the way the jukebox notes bent when the needle snagged. The man in booth 13 sat up straighter and set his empty fork down with a soft, precise sound like a metronome. A small humming began under the diner, like a vein of electricity. The lights in the fluorescent strip went thinner, and for a moment the diner seemed to fold into itself, and the formica glinted like a river at high tide. The hagstone in my pocket vibrated faintly against my thigh. I could feel it like someone tapping my ankle to remind me to wake up. No one spoke. Even the air listened. The second the clock hit 3:33, the phone rang 3 times. I picked it up. The line was a whisper and a paper scrape. "Look to the booth," said the voice. "Freely given, not taken." I stood, the counter cold under my palms. For the first time, the rules of the card were not a list, but a lifeline. The diner leaned toward me, obliging me to make a choice I had not signed up to make when I answered Help Wanted ad with a busted radiator and an empty bank account. Something in the air shifted like a note resolving. At the threshold, the bell chimed once more. The door opened not with the wind, but because someone nudged it. Outside, the moon hung fat and patient over the field. Inside, I felt the weight of the laminated card in my pocket and the whole of the hagstone against my skin like a secret I couldn't forget. And then, with the air of someone who has been making up their mind for a long time, the figure from the porch slipped across the threshold and took a seat. The thing about night work is that you get used to people who seem like caricatures of human sorrow. Truckers, traveling nurses, transient lovers. You get used to the way loss smells like old coats. This figure, though, when it sat down at booth 13, brought with it the hush of something older than the diner. It didn't look human, exactly. Instead, it looked like the memory of a human, the kind of residue left after a photograph is left in the sun too long. I had a moment where I could have followed the first rule on the laminated card, the one about names. I thought about saying something about the rain, or the pie, or the music, and then, remembering the boy with marshmallows who had tucked one away in his pocket, I thought about Margaret and her careful loops. I thought about Eileen in faded ink. The rules were not just rules of a job. They were promises made in a ledger I had not been allowed to see until I was already part of the entry. The card had opened my eyes to the fact that the diner was not merely a place to serve coffee, but a hinge where people came to finish something. It was a way station, and I had, accidentally, taken a shift as its steward. I still didn't know what I would offer if the collector came asking. I only knew the cost was never what it said up front. I only knew the hagstone in my pocket wanted me to look, and that, when you looked, you saw the seam. The bell chimed again. The figure in booth 13 set its wrapped thing on the table and drew back as if the room had become too small for it. The clock glinted toward 3:40, and the jukebox, inexplicably, started a tune I knew from my childhood, all warped and sweet. My hand went to the laminated card, for reassurance, as if the words could hold back the night. Outside, in the fields, the moon swelled, and for the first time since I had driven in with a busted radiator and a duffel full of clothes, the moon swelled like a blue coin right over the fields, and the diner seemed to hold its breath. Everybody in the room, Mabel, Eddie, Iris, the few regulars who lingered like warm stains on a table, felt it. Even the jukebox seemed to slow in recognition. The light took on a wash that made chrome look liquid and vinyl stools like small islands. Outside, the road vanished into a band of pale blue that shimmered at the horizon. We had planned for noise and for the collector's appetite. We had inked sigils in grease under tablet tops, drawn salt lines, planted iron at the four corners of the old foundation, and wrapped the hagstone in oilcloth until it hummed like a trapped insect. We had practiced the cadence of phrases Margaret had left, like instructions for someone with steady hands and an honest mouth. We had read the card aloud until the words fell into us and felt older than the skin they lived under. Still, there is always a moment they do not tell you about in the books, when the rules you rehearsed suddenly feel as small and brittle as paper, and the thing on the other side of them grows impatient. It is a particular kind of cold that settles in your throat like river water, clear and immediate, and it tells you that the ledger is moving its pen. At 3:33 on the diner clock, all the small clocks synchronized. The fluorescent strips above our heads thinned, and the hum under the booths tightened into a single tone like a tuning fork. The phone rang, 3 notes like sparrows, and when I lifted the receiver on the third, the voice I had heard before whispered, "Now." A sound answered the voice, not words, but a sift of something moving against itself. The bell at the door chimed as if someone had dropped a coin into the slot of time. A figure crossed the threshold and sat without looking at the room. It was the same ruin of a man who'd left a child's shoe in booth 13 last week. He was, if anything, less whole now, stitched edges where a seam had split. He set down the wrapped thing and folded his hands so the knuckles shone like frayed rope. Then the temperature changed. The air tightened around us like a glove. I felt it in my molars and in the way my breath made small clouds when it met the diner light. The hagstone in my pocket warmed like a living thing. The hole felt like an eye staring at the sky. Iris moved as if someone had called a bell in her sternum. She crossed to booth 13 without any theatricality, just a walk that held too many summers, and she sat opposite the man. She put her hand flat on the table, palm down, and the room stilled. "You don't have to take this alone," she said. Her voice carried no witchy flourish then. It was the clear, plain thing of someone who holds a ledger for the living. The man in the booth did not look at her. His mouth shaped something like gratitude and a small apology. He peeled back the cloth, and the child's shoe was revealed like a relic. It was tiny, worn thin by use, lace carbon black from old dirt. The shoe sat on the table like the hinge of a story. I didn't understand what the shoe had to do with anything, except that Margaret's notes said objects left in booth 13 were often the places where bargains slept.
I thought of the marshmallow boy and the way children kept one sweet for luck. I thought of Eileen's name written in a margin and of lines left for me to read. "Collector," the man said without moving his lips. The word itself had no malice in the mouth that said it. It was efficiency wrapped in old cloth. It was then I realized, with a clarity that felt like light cracking bone, that the man was not the collector. He was a marker. The collector did not always arrive in one shape. Sometimes it sent a bellboy with a package. Sometimes it appears as a ledger reviewer. Sometimes it came as an absence where a person should have been. This man at booth 13 was the precedent, the small thing that told the bigger thing where to come. "You're marked," Iris said to me quietly, and for the first time the word didn't sound like a rumor. It sounded like a fact that would not be argued. Marked. She curled her fingers under the table and tapped twice. It saw your name in the margins of an old contract. I thought of the pencil note on the laminated card. If a collector marks you, do not sleep entire.
I thought of the nights I had slept poorly in the cot behind the freezer and of the hagstone warm under my pillow. My mouth went dry. The laminated card had been a talisman. It had not been an answer. Eddie moved with the economy of someone who has always done the heavy work of other people's grief. He came around from the grill carrying a plate of cherry pie for the man, a ritual Mabel had always done because sometimes the world required you to keep the mundane moving. He set the plate down like a priest setting an offering. "You're not here for the food," Mabel said, the way someone might point out that rain falls whether you notice it or not. She was behind me, her hand heavy on the counter. Her presence was a muscle. "You know what you want. The question is whether we'll hand it over." There are bargains that involve pain, and bargains that involve handing over a thing you never realized you owned, your voice, your sight, your tendency to wander. And there are bargains that ask for names and then eat them in the dark. The ledger that bound a Cassidy had been written in an old hand and left a margin that said, "Payment due at the next great crossing." Freely given, the margins had insisted in a different pen. Loopholes existed because someone had decided to write them there, not because they were kind, but because they preferred the math of consent. "How do we stop it?" I asked. And the question bristled against my teeth because it wanted to be the kind of question that could be answered with a list. Iris drew in breath, and the hagstone in my pocket thrummed. "We don't stop it," she said. "We redirect its hunger." Eileen wrote a clause, "Equal value, freely given." It's not the soul that must be offered, it's power. You can contest a claim if you present something that balances the ledger without stealing what doesn't belong to you. Power, I repeated, and the word felt ridiculous and right at once. Power was not something you could count like coins. Margaret's notes suggested a method. Convert blood to binding with a hagstone focus, fold the sigils, salt the thresholds, and feed the seam a price that was willing and whole. "Who will give?" Mabel asked, not shouting but asking the question everyone wanted the answer to. She tasted the edge of the night with her words. "You? Iris? One of us? The rules say it must be freely given." I felt the room tilt toward me, as if the diner had decided I was the easiest person to press against. Part of me, the indignant part, flashed, "You're not going to make me give anything I don't want to." Another part, older, softer, recognized that sometimes choices are not given in rooms with upholstered booths and fluorescent lights. They are made in the quiet when you realize someone has written your name in ink and you have to decide whether to sign over the rest of the page. I stepped forward before I could talk myself out of it. "I'll offer something," I said. My voice surprised me with how steady it was. "I don't know what else to do." Iris's eyes softened and then narrowed like a seamstress pinning a hem. She took my hand in a way that steadied both of us. "It must be freely given," she repeated, and when she said it, her tone was not an instruction, but a covenant between two people. She glanced at the man in booth 13, then at the hagstone heavy against my thigh. "Your blood can be the conduit," she said. My power can be the pledge. If I place what I have into the hagstone and you use the blood willingly to bind it to the sigils, we can present the collector with an equal value." Mabel exhaled a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Eddie shook his head like someone who saw the practical side of sorrow and decided it must be cleared away. "We do this right," he said, and that was the only order we needed. Margaret's journal lay open on the counter between us, pages weighted down by a spoon. We followed the script she had left: phrases for calling the threshold, diagrams for the sigils, the instructions for salt placement, the iron nails hammered into the corners. Iris traced the ring she had taught herself to draw, a circle of teeth that looked like it would gnaw at the seam until it sewed shut. Her fingers moved sure, as if she had practiced on the backs of her hands for a lifetime. We lined the diner with salt at the thresholds, 2 lines, precise and white against the settled grime, and hammered iron rods into the 4 cardinal corners of the foundation. It felt theatrical, but old practices are often as much theater as they are work. The motion itself convinces some unseen ledger reader that you mean business. Eddie put keys in the pockets of apron and trousers, blunt iron tools, horseshoe fragments left from truckers' pockets, and a rusted meat cleaver he swore by. And we planted those at compass points. Mabel lit candles at each table and laid a single circle of coffee grounds around booth 13. The smell of steaming cherry pie mixed with earth and iron and made something like a prayer in my stomach. We arranged the sigils Margaret had carved, clock face patterns and tiny crescents, in a ring under the sealed seam of booth 13. The lines had to be exact, no hesitation, no wavering. Iris used the hagstone to check the lines she drew. The stone didn't show the sigils to human sight the way a lantern lights a room. Instead, it made the voids between things visible, where the wood did not join, where the number 13 had teeth. The hagstone focused what lay thin and let us stitch it. At some point, the head of the man in the booth tilted, and the wrapped child's shoe began to breathe like folded paper. It was then that Margaret, if Margaret could be said to be present in the room, suddenly clacked a cup against the counter somewhere behind me. The clatter was like a punctuation. Margaret's presence disentangled from the napkins and jurisprudence and seemed to float in the jars of sugar, a small, cold attention that settled on our hands.
"You do what you must," her voice said, not audibly, but in the way rooms make themselves known. It felt like an admonition and a benediction at once. Iris took off her gloves and placed both hands over the hagstone in my palm. The stone was warm and alive. She closed her eyes and hummed a tone I recognized as old as the wood in the booths. The sound made the jukebox's slowed notes wobble, and the diner answered with a hollow resonance like a glass being stroked. "Everyone who stays must consent to the terms," she said. "If someone refuses, we will not take them." Margaret insisted on that. She loved loopholes the way some people love puzzles. She wanted truth to be an ally. A hush settled over the diner. The world tilted into a small, holy corridor where only the things we had prepared had meaning. "Do you understand what you'll lose?" Iris asked me softly. She let go of the hagstone for a moment and took my face in both hands like someone steadying a map. "If this works, I will lay down, temporarily, perhaps forever, the small crafts that let me read thin places. I'll give it into the hagstone as a pledge." I saw the number of years carved into Iris's hands, hair, hours, a kind of knowledge that is both a tool and a weight. She was offering a part of herself that allowed her to do what Margaret had done: see the seam, coax the stubborn lost into passage. She was offering a faculty that had likely saved us many times. In return, the ritual hoped to buy enough of a binding that the collector would accept equal value and leave without taking what had been promised in the old ledger. "Yes," I said. The word felt both like myself and like something borrowed. "If that's what it takes." Mabel set a plain cup in front of me and a single needle. "You bleed into the sigil," she said simply. "Drop 3 drops of blood inside the ring and speak the phrases Margaret wrote. Let the hagstone hold what Iris places. Offer the power willingly, no trick. If you hesitate, stop." I did not want to be boastful about courage. Fear pulsed like a second heartbeat. But the choice had to be made, or the alternative was worse. I pricked my fingertip with the needle. The pain was immediate and honest. Blood welled like a tiny sun. I let the first drop fall onto the wood, where it darkened the grain and spread into the painted sigil. The second drop fell and feathered across the lines. The third I placed in the hollow of the hagstone and rested my thumb over it. The stone took the blood like a thirsty thing and warmed beneath my skin. Iris began the phrases Margaret had left, words in a rhythm that was more arithmetic than language, counting breaths more than syllables. The sigils around booth 13 brightened, not with light, but with something like tautness. The salt lines shivered and dust motes rose like startled birds. The jukebox went still. The song halted mid-phrase. Outside, the moon pressed its blue face against the glass and made everything silver.
The man in booth 13 rose and placed the child's shoe gently on the tabletop as if he were giving us the center of his worry. Then the building took a sound like a thing wanting to be let back into itself. A low, gathering, granular noise like coins sliding down a chute. The collector arrived not as a person but as a change in the room. The lights thinned, the air lightened, and my joints felt a pressure as if the world were being wrapped in a band. "The collector takes what is unbound," a voice said, not from the phone this time, but from nowhere and everywhere at once. It had no face but infinite patience. It tested the sigils with a sound like a thumb on paper. "You will offer." Iris tightened her grip on the hagstone in my hand. Her voice grew louder with the cadence. "We offer instead the pledge of willing power," she intoned. "We will convert voluntary strength into a binding equal in weight." The collector made a sound that was not audible yet felt like bones rethinking. The room tasted metallic, and my mouth filled with the memory of pennies. The man in booth 13 began to dissolve at the edges into a sort of outline, as if someone were erasing a charcoal drawing and letting the smudge go. For a second, he looked like he might be relieved. But the ledger has its tricks. "A ledger accepts only equivalents," the thing said. "Show me the value." I felt the hagstone vibrate like a small heart under my palm. Iris put both hands onto my own and placed her forehead against mine, a gesture both intimate and ritual. The hagstone became an amplifier. The warmth of my blood met the cold of the stone's hole, and Iris's offered power flowed through her hands as if through a filament. The sigils drank the mixed current like ground drinking a rainstorm. Margaret's phrases reached a peak we had practiced. Freely given, not taken, ours to offer, equal value, seal. I repeated them like a child repeating catechism, not because I knew the meaning, but because my voice tightly held the shapes of the words and the ritual asked for a human thread. The diner shivered. The collector pressed back, a reader trying to balance scales. The air thickened with the smell of ozone and cheese and the copper of my own blood. I felt a tug in the core of me, as if a ledger were weighing my life against the terms I had signed. But it wasn't my life precisely. It was power, something unnameable in me that was more stubborn than my fear. Perhaps part of it was lineage, that low-level current that hums through family names like a second heartbeat. Perhaps it was the hagstone making small things visible and larger things possible. Iris let go of her breath, and the room filled with the sound of it. "Take the pledge," she said to the collector, and I understood then that she had given in to the possibility of being less than she had been. Through the hagstone, I felt the ripple of the thing we were making, not a sacrifice of the soul, but a payment of ability, an undoing of one set of tools in exchange for a ceiling that might make 1,000 small griefs less damaging. The collector extended its will. It tasted the pledge, and my skin crawled with the sensation of measurement. For a moment, it tested the edges of Iris's giving and my blood like a hand on scales. Then it withdrew like a person tasting a soup and deciding it was acceptable. It was not a victory that sang. It was the slow, creaking sound of a door being relocked. The sigils glowed with a faint blue that matched the moon, then died down. The booth's seams sealed like old glue knitting rough wood. The man's outline became less urgent, his need smoothed into an acceptance. He took the child's shoe and, with a small, private bow, slid it onto his foot. Then he stood and moved toward the door. The bell chimed once, polite as a clock. The man crossed the threshold into the blue and did not look back. The road, the fields, the moon, they washed him away. For a moment, in his leaving, the diner felt lighter by the weight the shoe had carried. When the door closed, the room exhaled. The jukebox took up air and played a record like one blowing dust off an old friend. Margaret made a small sound, contentment, that manifested as a napkin flutter. The hagstone cooled against my skin like a small animal at the end of a long run. Iris sagged in her chair, the lines around her mouth older for the night. Her hands trembled and then lay still. "It's bound," she said, "for now." The ledger accepted equivalence. Eddie popped a pot lid and exhaled a laugh that had no humor in it. Mabel set down a cup of coffee in front of me and poured with hands that did not shake. "You did it," she said. "You kept the rules." I had kept them, but kept is a small word for the way the world had shifted. I expected fanfare or a certain kind of triumph. Instead, there was a cost that arrived in quiet ways. Iris's eyes, sharp as needles all night, no longer had that particular light when she blinked. Her fingers no longer found the hidden seams of cups and tables the way they used to. Later she would tell me that small things no longer sang to her the way they had, that the hedgecraft that had been her livelihood felt dulled, like an instrument left in the rain. It was freely given, she said, more to herself than to any of us. That matters. Margaret would have ranted if I'd tried to swap her charm for a debt. She preferred a clean bargain. The laminated card, thin, ordinary plastic, felt unbearably heavy in my pocket. It had been a map, and now it felt like a ledger entry with my name in it. I understood then the other cost. The binding had not taken my life, nor had it stolen Iris's soul, but the balance paid in terms that unrolled slowly. A relocation of abilities, a contract written into veins and walls and salt. The diner had been made less porous. The seam had been stitched with a line that would last beyond our immediate understanding. Over the following days, the diner changed in small, practical ways that made the magic feel like a kitchen remodel. The sigils sat under the varnish of booth 13, and when you ran a hand across the surface, you could feel nothing, but the knowledge of them made the booth more solemn. The iron at the corners darkened like healed scars. Salt lines stayed white even in the scuff of shoes. People found new, polite ways to step over them. We sat with what had been lost. Iris moved like someone reorienting to a body that had been rewired. She could no longer read thread-thin pockets of the world as she had, but she had agency in the choice she had made. It was odd consolation. She gave something, she lost something, and she had not been taken from. That counted in the mathematics of this life. And yet the diner itself had changed in ways that made the nights feel different. The way station had become a small fortress. Patrons, both living and otherwise, seemed to notice and defer. Frank, the man who had once marked himself in patterns of absence, began to sit in a booth near the back and hum like a metronome, an unquiet presence that now had a job that felt like remedy. He watched the parking lot and reported small anomalies in the creak of tires.
Margaret's ghost, so far more present than I'd expected, took to polishing the spoons in a slow motion that made them ring like tiny bells whenever trouble stirred. People still came through. Some were husks of stories, and others were nearly whole people with heavy knapsacks of delay. They left things behind: a photograph, a button, a shoe. Margaret cataloged them in her book as if none of these little griefs were insignificant. She'd scrawl her looping handwriting in the margins: held, let go at will. That phrase felt like a small liturgy in our mornings. The collector, for all its efficiency, did not return in force for some time. Maybe it respects those who offer payment rather than theft. Maybe it is a bureaucracy of the metaphysical and respects proper procedure. Either way, the pressure that had built toward the blue moon night eased. It did not go away. It became a background like weather, an occasional oddity when the phone rang 3 times and the voice asked a polite question about threshold keeping. The most permanent thing, for me, was how the diner rewired my life. Before the blue moon, I had the thought that one could slip away after a month or two, when the money made sense and the hours fit a schedule. Afterward, I had the sensation of threads. When people asked me whether I would leave, or when somebody recommended a job in another town, the idea felt like stepping out of clothing that had been sewn into me. There is a thing called obligation. It does not have a need morality attached. It is simply the weight you bear because you have been given a role that uses you better than any other you'd had.
Mabel, with her tobacco hands and coffee breath, looked at me across the counter one night and said, "You kept your hands steady. You'll be here a while." "It's not a sentence," I said. "It's a responsibility." "Too true," she said. "Some folks are cowed by responsibility. We got beat up by it, learned its better parts." Eddie returned to his station at the stove and continued to cook the way ordinary labor mends the mind. He did not speak often about the night. He preferred to let the work be the sermon. But sometimes, when he slid a plate across to a patron who looked like they'd left a grief on the pavement, his eyes would flick toward booth 13 and hold a soft kind of query that said, "We saved them this time." Sometimes the diner felt lighter. People who had come in with heavy little encumbrances left them behind like lint on a sleeve. The marshmallow ritual, count 7, let 1 be kept, remained. Children still tucked a sweet into a pocket on their way out, and sometimes the candy was enough. The phone still rang 3 times. We answered on the 3rd. The rules were less magic now and more posture. They had become a manner of offering decency to the thin people who drifted through. Iris slept in small intervals and got up with a particular look, like someone who had been given a second life made of different privileges. She taught me how to read Margaret's marginalia without trying to force every line into urgent action. She showed me how to fold sigils into napkin patterns so they would not be obvious to the uninitiated but would hold when needed. "Guarding is not heroics," she told me one afternoon as rain stitch-mended the windows. "It's housekeeping with stakes. It's keeping the kettle on because people will come back. It's keeping a claim on doorways. You do 100 small things, and the world pays you a little serenity in return." Frank, who had been a postal worker in a loop somewhere between stops, took to doing rounds at the edge of parking lot. He watched headlights and left a small cone of salt at the gravel when the weather felt wrong. He'd been part of the furniture long enough to have opinions. One night, he left a letter on the counter that no one could read. The ink had come off the paper like old advertisements. Margaret translated it for me with a gentle mockery. "Old thanks from the road. Keep the coffee hot." The diner became, physically, a bit stronger. Patrons who lingered while the moon did strange things sometimes left antique odds and ends: horseshoes, rusted iron, a child's brass bell. We put these things into a box under the counter, and when the night was still, we'd draw them out and set them as talismans. They were not a replacement for ritual, but people find ways to believe, to build small altars of luck out of what they have. We like to tell ourselves that the box held luck, but really, it held the evidence that small acts have meanings. People often asked me, offhand, whether I regretted the night. They asked it like they imagined a person in my place would long for the life they'd left. The honest reply is that I mourn sometimes for the life that might have been, nights on other roads, a less complicated future. But there is also this. Guarding a way station teaches you a new kind of gratitude. You learn to appreciate the ordinary moments, the way sailors appreciate land. A cup of coffee held heavy in two hands, a slice of pie that tastes like someone's insistence on sweetness in a rotten world. Iris's loss of hedgecraft was real. She told me once, sitting in a booth with a steaming coffee, her hands cupped around the mug, that the world no longer holds the thin places in the same way. I can touch the seam, she said, but I can't read the stitches like I used to. It's as if my eyes are softer. It hurts, but in a different register. She was not bitter. She had offered willingly and had agency in that. If anything, she became more blunt and human, less given to the illusions hedgecraft can produce. She liked to say that sometimes magic makes people grander than they should be. Without it, she had been forced to be practical in new ways. The human cost is not only weighty because it is pain, sometimes it is weighty because it calls you back to simpler duties. There were nights, months later, when phone calls came early and the voice on the third ring would remind us that the collector keeps track of its ledgers. It would not be as aggressive as before, but it would probe, a subtle test, a practice of a hand on the seam to see if the stitches held. When those calls came, we did the rituals again on a smaller scale. A sweep of salt, a quick redrawing of sigils, a boil of coffee poured into a ring. Sometimes mistakes happen. Once, in the first months after the binding, someone, an overzealous repairman, scraped at the varnish over booth 13 to see if the wood had anything under it. The action was innocent enough in intention. The results were not. The jukebox slowed and the lights took on the wrong color. For a moment there was a hunger on the other side, like a fingertip running a nail over a seam. We found the repairman frozen in his truck, staring at the road, suddenly unable to move because his own curiosity had unlocked something in him that didn't want to be there. We had to help him. We wrapped him in a blanket and fed him pie until he could remember his name aloud and realize that the question that had made him paw at the varnish could be left unanswered once in a while. Because Margaret preferred loopholes that required consent, we made a small practice of asking when someone came in, "Are you carrying something you'd rather let go of?" An odd question for a diner, but the people who needed us understood. They would put down a photograph or a child's shoe or a button, and we would hold it carefully until they were ready to move on. We became a kind of social worker for phantom items. People started to call us, sometimes by accident, the gatekeepers, when they knew the jokes to tell. Mabel would laugh and toss sugar packets at them like a queen stingy with her crown. "We run a kitchen," she'd say, "but sometimes we run a doorway." And me, I had days where my hands ached like old wood, and nights where dreams wove themselves into catalogs of small decisions. I had a neat stack of notes from Margaret, and an even neater sense of what to do when the phone chimed. I learned to read the room, not like a novel, but like a weather report. Low pressure is coming, bring an umbrella of salt. Sometimes the guardianship offered small miracles. A woman who had been stranded and insisted she could not find her mother's grave came in carrying a folded photograph. Margaret leafed through her journal and then found an entry with a name and a map scratch. We gave the woman a slice of pie and a ride in Eddie's old truck out to a road that liked to hide markers. She found the grave and cried until words ran out. That kind of thing made the job mean something beyond rent and hours and fluorescent hum. Other times the job took from me in ways I hadn't counted. The binding made me attentive to thresholds in ways that made leaving harder. I found myself counting the marshmallows in hotels, resettling salt at motel doors. Old friends called and said, "When are you coming back?" And I struggled to explain the thread that tied me. They heard only the words and not the ledger ink that had my name in its corner. There were tests, too.
A blue moon, 2 years on, tried to come again, and the collector tested the seam with something that resembled regret. It sent an old woman into us who had been lost between her ways and her nights. She had a habit of telling long stories and then forgetting them. We held her stories like bread and fed them back to her until she could carry them home. Each time the collector probes, it learns. Each time we practice keeping the rules, we refine our response. One cloudy October after the binding, a kid came in with 7 marshmallows in his palm and 13 freckles that looked like spilled stars. He put one on the counter and asked, right away, if I knew the rules. I told him, "The card says, do not ask names, never follow a customer to the parking lot, count to 7 before clearing a child's cup, booth 13 holds its bargains, the phone rings 3 times only, salt the thresholds. If you see someone dry in the rain, seat them." He listened like someone reading a map. "I like rules," he said. "They make things fair." "They do," I told him. "They make a way for people to be kind when the world is not." The kid laughed, a small, delighted sound. He left a marshmallow in his pocket. I watched him go and felt the old sense of being a steward of small kindness. Years fold into other years. The diner, the last stop, persisted. It became a place people could joke about and a place other people whispered about.
Teenagers dared each other to sit in booth 13. Old regulars would tap their fingers on the counter at 3:33 to see if the clock still took note. When the phone rang 3 times, we answered on the 3rd like faithful watchmen. Sometimes, in the calm between storms, I would stand at the back door and think of Eileen, a name inked in the margins, the woman who had made the original bargain that had cursed and saved us in equal measure. Whatever I had imagined of blood and bargaining in my head, it had been smaller and more human than I thought. Eileen had tried things others wouldn't try. She had left a loophole. We had walked into it and made the choice to honor it without trickery. That, perhaps, was what mattered most, the honesty of the price. In the end, the last change was subtle and wonderful. The diner that once felt like a hinge now resembled, at moments, a home. People learned to come and sit and tell stories they had been carrying in their pockets. Margaret kept her journal thick with names. Frank began to teach a small class in the art of watching the road. Mabel put a sign on the shelf that read, in crooked handwriting, "We mend what we can." I take the nights, mostly, and when the wind presses on the siding and the neon hums, I wipe the formica and set out pies like little apologies and small miracles. I have scars, not the glamorous ones in movies, but the real ones. I find it harder to leave when offers come. There is a pull in the marrow now, the sense that I belong to more than myself. I do not regret it. I have also discovered something else. The job that started as a way to fix a busted radiator became a map to a life I never planned but learned to love. Booth 13 still holds bargains. The laminated card is still in my pocket on nights I need the confidence of rules. The phone still rings its 3 notes in the small hours. The hagstone sits in a cloth on the shelf, used less often now because the seal is stitched and we are watchful. On nights when the moon is wrong, we check the iron rods, we sweep salt, and we whisper Margaret's words. We honor the ledger with the truth, freely given, not taken. People sometimes ask, when I tell them the story, whether the collector ever will come back and take what was promised in some other way. I tell them that the world is not neat and there are always cracks. But I also tell them this: bargains can be rewritten if people are willing to stand in the seam and speak honestly about what they will give. It is not fair or easy. It is not without cost, but at least it is with consent. If you had a weird job where a rule card could be a talisman or a threat, what would you be willing to give to keep a door closed? If you could rewrite an old bargain, would you? Tell me below, and if you want more stories from nights when coffee is a prayer and pie is a promise, like and subscribe for more midnight tales.